Breaking news out of Indiana. A child sexual abuse material investigation has now widened into a second, separate set of felony allegations, this time involving a family dog. Police say the trail started with a routine stop of a registered sex offender, led to a phone packed with illegal material, and then revealed videos investigators say show a 26-year-old woman committing animal sexual abuse. So what exactly did detectives say they find, and how did they link it to her? Why does the timeline stretch across months, and how does a recorded confession square with the defense she's now putting online? Here's what's known, what court records lay out, and what questions are likely to shape the next phase of the case. A massive child sexual abuse material investigation in Indiana has led police to what investigators describe as a separate, deeply disturbing discovery. A probable cause affidavit alleges that videos found on a seized phone show a woman, 26-year-old Cassie Snay, engaged in sexual acts involving a dog. Snay now faces felony counts of bestiality under Indiana law, based on the affidavit's description of digital evidence and what investigators say she later admitted in a recorded interview. This case is unusual not only because of the allegations, but because of how authorities say they found it. It did not begin with a complaint about animal abuse. It began with an investigation into a registered sex offender, an inquiry focused on compliance with sex offender registry rules. From there, detectives say, a traffic stop produced a search warrant, and that warrant produced devices. Those devices, according to investigators, contained an enormous volume of child sexual abuse material, alongside videos that investigators say pointed to Snay. At the center of the first part of the investigation is Trey Mettler, described in the affidavit as a registered sex offender in Indiana. The documents state he is classified as a sexually violent predator, a status tied to a 2014 child molesting conviction. Court filings cited in the narrative describe a pattern of repeated non-compliance with registry requirements. Records referenced in the account indicate convictions for failing to register in 2022, again in 2023, and again in early 2025. That history matters because it sets the stage for why deputies were looking for him in the first place. The affidavit states that in December 2024, the Wells County Sheriff's Office opened an investigation because Mettler allegedly failed to update his address, an offense for someone required to comply with registry rules. In other words, the initial focus was not a new violent crime allegation. It was a compliance case. But compliance cases can open doors, and in this instance, investigators say it opened the door to something far larger. In January 2025, according to the affidavit, a detective pulled Mettler over, arrested him for failing to register, and obtained a warrant to search his car. Inside, police say they found drugs, drug paraphernalia, and 2 cell phones, one described as an iPhone 14 in a red case. The stop also led to additional charges for Mettler. Court documents described in the narrative indicate he was charged not just with failing to register, but with possession of methamphetamine, possession of a narcotic drug, and, most significant for what followed, possession of child pornography. What investigators describe next is the scale of what they say was on that phone. The affidavit alleges the iPhone contained a vault of child sexual abuse material, with what police described as roughly 69,000 images and 11,000 videos. The documents also reference platforms and apps where investigators say some of that content was accessed or stored, including Telegram, Snapchat, and Kik. At that point, the investigation becomes less about a single incident and more about triage, sorting, tagging, and categorizing what detectives say is a staggering volume of illegal content. And it's within that process, according to the affidavit, that investigators say they began seeing photos and videos of a woman they recognized. That woman, investigators say, was Cassie Snay. The affidavit states that Snay and Mettler had an on-and-off relationship. Detectives say material on the phone appeared to show Snay at her home in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And the affidavit points to one category of files in particular, files investigators say depict Snay in sexual acts involving a dog. That subset is what ultimately led to Snay being charged with 2 counts of bestiality. The affidavit outlines how the evidence was organized and reviewed. After identifying numerous photos and videos of Snay on the iPhone, the investigator reviewed them and compiled a detailed list of files that prosecutors are now using as the foundation for the 2 felony counts. The document references forensic tags and creation dates for specific media items. While the affidavit itself is described as graphic, the essential allegation is straightforward. Investigators claim the files show a pattern of sexual activity involving Snay and a family dog. The timeline, as presented in the affidavit, stretches across months. The document states that one incident was recorded on January 17, 2024. It then alleges additional videos and photos spanning from January through October 2024. The affidavit states these files depict Snay engaging in sexual activity with the same dog, a black and tan canine that she later identified by name during her interview, according to the document. The affidavit also references sexual conduct during video calls, and it includes a location note tied to one file's GPS data. According to the document, GPS information from one file indicated an alleged incident occurred at a Motel 6. The affidavit further states that Snay later acknowledged that some incidents occurred either at her mother's residence in Allen County or at a Motel 6. That location detail matters because it connects the alleged conduct to a specific jurisdiction, Allen County, and supports the charging decision there. For prosecutors, digital media is not just about what appears on screen. It's about timestamps, metadata, GPS indicators, and the ability to place alleged conduct inside a county where a court has authority. Then comes what investigators present as the strongest piece of their chain: a recorded interview and an alleged confession. The affidavit states that on September 19, 2025, a detective conducted a recorded, Mirandized interview with Cassie Snay. And the document's conclusion asserts that during this interview, Snay admitted to committing the crimes, including making and sending the photos and videos to Mettler via cell phone. The affidavit also states that she acknowledged the dog in the videos and photos and identified the locations where the conduct occurred. Put together, the affidavit frames the case as a sequence of steps that reinforce each other. An investigation into a registered sex offender leads to a phone. A forensic review of that phone leads to media files. The files point to Snay, and then, investigators say, Snay confirms the conduct and the distribution of the media in a recorded interview. From the state's perspective, that's the structure: digital evidence plus metadata plus a confession. In probable cause terms, that combination is typically presented as sufficient to move forward with charges, obtain an arrest warrant, and keep a case on track in court. But this case does not end with the affidavit's narrative. After the recorded interview described in the document, Snay began offering a very different explanation publicly, one that directly contradicts the implication that her actions were voluntary. Messages reviewed in the reporting cited in the transcript describe Snay claiming she was coerced through violence by Mettler. In online comments, she suggests she was forced and beaten, and she indicates she intends to prove her claims. The thrust of the defense is that the conduct shown in the videos was not consensual behavior. She frames it as something done under threat and physical harm. That's a dramatic pivot, from what investigators describe as an admission during a Mirandized interview to a public claim that she was forced. And it raises immediate questions about what evidence exists beyond online statements. Questions that tend to matter in any coercion claim. If a defense is coercion, investigators and courts typically look for corroboration. That can mean documented injuries, medical records, police reports, witness statements, messages showing threats, prior complaints, shelter records, or other forms of proof that can be independently verified. The transcript also reflects the harsh skepticism that can appear in public reactions. Some responses argue that if there was evidence of abuse, there were avenues to report it and seek help, and they reject the claim that coercion explains everything. Public skepticism, however, is not evidence. Courts separate what people argue online from what can be proven. The real question is whether any factual record supports her claim, especially in light of the affidavit's assertion that she admitted the conduct in a recorded interview after being advised of her rights. Snay's legal posture is now defined by the formal charges and the early court steps. The transcript states she was charged on December 9th with 2 counts of bestiality, each classified as a Level 6 felony in Indiana. According to the court docket described, she was arrested on a warrant, made her initial appearance in Allen Superior Court on December 15th, and the court found probable cause to proceed. At that initial hearing, the record described in the transcript indicates the court appointed a public defender and released her from custody under a form of monitored conditional release while the case remains pending. That detail matters because it signals the court's initial risk assessment and the conditions it believes are appropriate while the case moves forward. What comes next, typically, is process. Additional hearings, discovery, motions, and decisions about what evidence can be used at trial. The defense may seek to challenge the circumstances of the interview, the handling of digital evidence, or the interpretation of files. Prosecutors will likely emphasize the forensic trail and the alleged confession. And if coercion becomes a central claim, it will likely come down to whether the defense can point to verifiable evidence supporting that narrative. This story also contains a broader conversation about animal abuse cases and why they can go underreported, especially when compared to crimes involving human victims. In the interview portion of the transcript, animal advocate and journalist Paul Mueller argues that cases involving bestiality and animal abuse are more common than many people assume, and he suggests that the internet and constant recording have made it more likely such cases are discovered and reported. Mueller also frames animal abuse as part of a wider pattern of violence in some offenders, citing the idea, described as supported by studies, that cycles of abuse can escalate and that animals can be targeted because they can't speak up. In his view, the victim's inability to report makes the crime both easier to conceal and harder to prosecute without strong documentation. Another point raised in the interview is the gap between public outrage and sentencing outcomes. Mueller suggests that in many animal abuse cases, advocates often see plea deals, suspended sentences, or what they view as penalties that don't match the harm. He also describes the reality that prosecutors and law enforcement may prioritize cases involving human victims because those cases tend to carry greater urgency and resources, leaving animal-only cases fighting for attention in crowded court systems. The interview also highlights the double edge of social media. On one hand, platforms can help advocates bring attention to cases and keep pressure on the system to follow through. On the other hand, platforms are also described as locations where illegal material is circulated and stored, creating both harm and, at times, evidence. In this case, the transcript emphasizes that investigators allegedly found the child's sexual abuse material through apps like Telegram, Snapchat, and Kik. That detail underscores a larger reality for modern investigations. Criminal cases increasingly hinge on digital trails, encrypted chats, file transfers, and metadata. Investigators often build cases not with a single eyewitness, but with device extractions, forensic tags, and the chain of custody that shows who had access to what and when. Finally, there's the question of what happens to an animal in a case like this. Mueller describes a common outcome. Animals may be taken into protective custody and held as evidence while a case is pending. They may remain in shelters or specialized care until the case concludes, and only afterward be placed with a foster or permanent home. It's a slow process, tied to the timeline of the court system. For the public, the temptation is to treat a case like this as a single headline, one shocking allegation, one arrest, one online defense. But the court record described here points to multiple layers: a registry compliance investigation, a massive digital evidence review tied to child sexual abuse material, a separate set of allegations involving an animal, and a defendant whose public claims now conflict with what police say she admitted in a recorded interview. And that's where the case stands. Allegations anchored in digital files, a confession described in the affidavit, and a coercion claim pushed into the public sphere. The next key questions are plain. Will the defense produce corroboration for claims of coercion, evidence that can survive scrutiny in court? Will prosecutors lean primarily on the recorded interview and forensic trail, or will additional witnesses and documentation become central? And how will the court weigh what's in the affidavit against what the defense may later argue in motions and hearings? For now, the only certainty is that a routine stop, a device search, and a forensic review have created a case that prosecutors say crosses into multiple categories of serious alleged abuse, now headed into the slower, decisive arena of the courtroom.